keeping everyone up to date. Next slide, please. And so today we decided to organize today's session according to the kind of 5 functions as it relates to data stewardship. As you might remember from the bootcamp or the intensive course, when we look at what are kind of the functions of data stewardship, we typically focus on 5 kinds of stewardship. One is stewarding data, then we have stewarding partnerships and stewarding internal relations. We then have, of course, stewarding sustainability, and also lastly, stewarding insights, because it's not just about the data, it's also about how do we make sure that the data subsequently get used, and how do we go from data intelligence to decision intelligence. And some of you might remember those 5 functions, which were reflected also in the data stewards canvas, of course, which guide us across the bootcamp and also across the way we start documenting some of the developments that we have as well. And so today I will quickly reflect on a few developments across those 5 functions that might be worthwhile knowing as well. Next slide. And so let's get started, of course, with what data stewardship, what everyone believes data stewardship is around, which is, of course, stewarding data. And by stewarding data, we really, of course, mean how do we provide access to data in a way that it can be reused in a more systematic, sustainable, and responsible way. And so that requires, of course, understanding what are the governance frameworks in place, but it also requires understanding what are some of the kind of technical developments that might be worthwhile understanding how you provide access to data, or how do you connect different data sets in ways that can be reused. And today we will also focus on kind of reuse for AI purposes, of course, which is kind of the latest use case that gets a lot of traction and like a lot of interest as well. Next slide. And the first element that we've curated is a little bit of a propaganda, but we still thought it might be good to share this, which is a new toolkit that I had the great fortune of developing together with the UN Broadband Commission. And the UN Broadband Commission is a very interesting commission because it's the only UN commission that connects the public and the private sector and international organizations. So it's actually chaired by 3 international bodies, which is the UNESCO, UNDP, and the ITU, but they also have private sector like GSMA, but also like large telcos and large satellite operators are members of the UN Broadband Commission. And one of the elements that they decided was needed was actually a data governance toolkit, because their members constantly got asked, how do we go about data governance? And so I was delighted to be able to lead this effort. And at the latest WSIS, which happened 2 weeks ago, I guess, we finally managed to release the current toolkit, which is still a living document. It's something that we will update on an ongoing basis. And by the way, we also will turn it into a course. So actually, after this call, I have another kind of session on how do we turn this into kind of a course, mainly for countries that are eager to start rethinking how they go about data governance. Now, the framework that we've used, and again, this is open access, of course, so feel free to have a look at it and see whether it's relevant. What we have included is a whole range of checklists, and one of the things that we already have heard from several governments and several government agencies and the private sector, what is quite useful is kind of the self-assessment that we have included on how do you score yourself as it relates to data governance. But the structure of the report is according to kind of those 4 elements that, of course, we also touched upon during the Data Stewards Bootcamp. One is, of course, how do you define the purpose and what should be kind of different ways of developing the purpose. Second element is then, of course, how do you define the principles so that you have a North Star in order to make decisions, which is then the third element. What are the processes and the processes and the people that need to be in place? And then the last element, of course, what are some of the practices and implementations of the decisions as it relates to um, the purpose that need to be implemented across the data lifecycle. Because ultimately, we define data governance here as the principles, the processes, and the practices that are needed to achieve the purpose of creating value of data in ways that minimize the harm as well. And that's why we have this kind of framework as well. And so, as I said, eager to hear whether any of the whether the toolkit is of interest, and we will update that and also connect it with kind of recent developments as we move forward as well. Next slide. Now, as we are talking about governance and about also developments in the kind of policy space, there were some interesting developments that might be worthwhile knowing as well, whether or not you're based in Europe or elsewhere, because it's kind of an interesting developments that might be of relevance to know across borders. The first one that I selected here is that the European Commission has developed a so-called delegated act to implement what is in the Digital Services Act, which is a provision that mandates for platform owners, think Google, think LinkedIn, think X, for instance. So there is a provision that researchers can request access to their data in a way that is mandated under the Digital Services Act, which is, of course, a really interesting development because it provides for kind of bargaining power. Because one of the, as you all know, one of the biggest challenges in the data space, especially in accessing private sector data and especially platform data, is of course that many researchers have no bargaining power to actually, anyway, A, be heard, and B, subsequently having access to leverage that data for generating insights, for instance, insights in how social media was used for during elections and so on. Now, the Digital Services Act has a provision that provides a mandate to request access and has also a mandate for then the platform owners to comply with that. Now, the question is, of course, how do you do this in practice? And so this is what the Delegated Act basically provides, is some more detail on how to implement that. And of interest as well is that they launched an additional website, which is listed there as well, which is called the DSA Data Access Portal, which basically gives more information on how you would go about requesting access and also how you would become a recognized researcher. Because one of the, as you might remember during the bootcamp, one of the elements that we discussed was how do you do due diligence with regard to access to data? And one way is to actually, anyway, have some kind of certification with regard to those that seek access. And so what they are trying to do within the Digital Services Act is to actually have a review process of who is a researcher and then have some kind of a certification that the researcher that is requesting access complies with a certain set of requirements so that you de-risk access to the data because you have actually screened and also certified the ones that are seeking access well. And so that's what this data access portal gives more information about. So you need to register as a researcher, and then also there will be some kind of due diligence with regard to who is requesting access on whether the researcher knows how to go about data stewardship, to be quite honest, and whether actually the researcher would be trusted when data is made available as well. So that's kind of the first, I think, kind of interesting policy development within the European Union context. Next slide. The other one that probably some of you have seen as well is that the United Kingdom actually also has now adopted a new piece of legislation, which is called the Data Use and Access Act 2025, DUA. And it's a very interesting piece of legislation that was promised by the new government, anyway, which has already, of course, been in place for more, I guess, about a year. But what the Act is doing is actually streamlining access to data. And so one of the elements that is mentioned here is that they will revisit this whole notion of consent as it relates to using private sector data for public interest purposes, such as, for instance, public health research. And what the Act states is that there is no need for actually asking consent for reuse if the purpose is documented in ways that clearly shows that there is a legitimate interest in having access to data. So that's kind of a first really important development, which aligns, of course, with some of our notions around social license, and will be interesting. I will show in a few moments also that actually within the UK, they're doing a lot of effort to then document that social license, which is kind of interesting. That goes beyond consent. So they would not require any more individual consent as long as you can document that there is some kind of a social consensus on having access to certain kind of data. The other elements, of course, is that they're going to get rid of the kind of notices for cookies, which of course was aligned with GDPR, and so they're moving away from that. And the other element of the Data Use and Access Acts is what they call advancing access to smart data. And smart data typically means non-traditional data. And so there's also a Smart Data Alliance in the UK. And actually, I just conducted together with some folks here at GovLab an intensive overview of actually the use of smart data for the Wellcome Trust for health and well-being. And so we see that this is getting a lot of traction within the context of the UK. And interesting is now that this is kind of a reuse legislation that facilitates reuse in kind of ways that try to go beyond the GDPR, right? Which is kind of interesting. And then the next policy development, anyway, there's a lot, of course, happening. I just made a selection here. Next, please. The next one is here in the US, where, of course, the current administration just released its AI action plan to so-called win the race, which basically provides the sentiment of the current geopolitical environment where kind of different countries, of course, are now competing with each other. And that also, of course, if you would look at the action plan, it basically means preventing legislation that would limit any action that could prevent them of winning the race. Now, there's a lot to be said that is problematic in the plan, but I do want to raise kind of three interesting elements that quite often is not covered in the current discussion of the America's Action Plan. The first one is that actually the action plan is advocating for open source and open weight AI, which I think is a very interesting recommendation, where they actually say that open source is their preferred way of going about advancing and developing AI. The second element is that they are advocating for AI sandboxes, and that's going to become kind of the really interesting kind of practical application. Of course, within Europe and elsewhere, they've been talking about AI sandboxes for a while, but there has not been that much kind of practice. But here within the action plan, they really are trying to advance that, which basically, again, is from the concept, well, don't legislate it, just try it first, and then look at what are the kind of aspects as well. And then the last one, and that goes back perhaps, Mark, to your comment as well, is that there are provisions with regard to data sets where they try to advance kind of new access to what they call world-class scientific data sets. And so what is interesting here is that for the last year, 2 years or so within the US, similar to elsewhere, they've been trying to come up with kind of the concept of what would be a national data library, right? So they call it a national secure data service. Similar to actually a little bit what's happening in the UK, where they are, of course, also advanced a national data library. And of course, anyway, other like in India, they have, of course, the national data stack as well that they are developing. And there are other countries as well that are stepping into that fray. But it's interesting is that this administration, anyway, keeps what was initiated in the previous administration, keeps it going. And so they are really ramping up this kind of investment in what they call the national data ecosystem. And that is mainly focused on having access to kind of scientific data assets, which is, of course, more open science than open government data because, of course, as we all know, what happens on open government data in the US is kind of the opposite, where we actually see more and more data sets disappearing. But at least they, within this action plan, they are trying to advance kind of access to scientific data as well, which I thought is interesting to mention because, again, typically this is not kind of raised in the whole discussion about the action plan as such. Next slide. So with that, these are kind of the the policy developments. Now, as it relates to technological developments, there are a few things, and again, none of this might be very new, but what is really happening is kind of um, the advancements of knowledge graphs, right? And knowledge graphs is, of course, something that has been around for a while, but I've now been engaged with many governments and also the private sector, of course, where they are really, in addition to developing data catalogs, what they are now developing more and more is kind of knowledge catalogs. And that becomes kind of a new knowledge graphs catalogs. And this is kind of a new function, I would say, for kind of the open data community, which is going beyond data catalogs and also looking into what would be knowledge graph catalogs, because knowledge graphs, to a large extent, of course, give an indication on what data needs to be linked in order to be able to answer a particular question or answer a particular kind of purpose. And it also allows you to then understand knowledge or data gaps, but also it allows you, of course, to subsequently make data AI ready because a knowledge graph also is needed in order to do some anyway graph, which is of course anyway a lot of it is underpins AI, Gen AI applications, right? And so I'd see it's interesting that, and that's something I wanted to anyway raise here is that from a data stewardship perspective, being able to develop those knowledge graph catalogs is going to become a really important new function and is something that I think is worthwhile taking into account because it also will allow us to perhaps advance open data, but also linked data, which is, of course, the other key challenge that we quite often have in this space. Next slide. And then the last element that is kind of trending, which some of you probably have heard as well. But as you know, I do a lot of work these days around this notion of AI-ready data, right? And which is kind of, as some of you might know, I've been advancing kind of the FAIR principles with double R, where we focus on findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, but now also ready for AI. And that's a big objective for data stewards, right? Is to apply with the FAIR principles, but now double R principles, right? And of course, key question, and of course, is how do we make data AI ready, and how does anyway, what is the level of AI readiness that we need to to have? And in the meantime, of course, what has come along is this model context protocol, which I think is which is where anyway many agencies that are looking into kind of uh, connecting data with AI, right, are now starting to develop applications around model context protocols, right, MCPs. And MCPs is a really interesting open standard that was developed by Anthropic the end of last year. And now, which is why I put it here, there's not a single day that goes by where I get an invitation to another kind of update on MCPs or another tutorial about, anyway, how do you apply MCPs within your context, which is why I put it out here as kind of something that you probably are already aware of, but you will come across in the next few weeks for sure. And so what does MCP do? I mean, they call it MCP, they compare it like the UBS drive for applications. And and so basically it connects different applications with AI. And so, and it doesn't require, first of all, it doesn't quite often require to make data AI ready anymore, because now, for instance, you can actually use an MCP application to actually ingest data into a particular kind of Gen AI model. So for instance, from a data stewardship perspective, you can, for instance, ask you can use MCP to, for instance, identify data gaps in databases. You can use MCP to see how you can improve data quality of a database, for instance, as well. And so there are really interesting applications that I think would be worthwhile considering if you not have it yet. You can also you can download it on your own computer and actually test it out on how you, for instance, anyway, you could actually ask if you have it on your computer, you can ask anyway, what are the latest meetings I've had, or you can schedule a meeting and so on. So it basically connects any application on your laptop with a foundational model, which I think is super interesting and quite revolutionary from my perspective. All right, so with that, these are kind of the elements with regard to data, stewarding data. Next slide, please. With that, let's go and focus on some elements on stewarding partnerships. Next slide. And of course, here, as I already mentioned, one of the elements that is super important for data stewards is, of course, to think about how do you get a social license, right? How do we understand what people want with regard to how data is being used, whether this is data that, anyway, is personal data or even data that is being collected in a non-personal kind of manner. But because data stewardship is all about the reuse of data, as already mentioned, it's quite often important to actually make sure that you a little bit go beyond the kind of assumption that if you have consent, that all will be fine. And so there are a few recent developments here. This is the one that happened within England, NHS England, where they actually developed a national engagement on data, which was super interesting, very intensive, where they basically, anyway, convened multiple stakeholders in order to get a better sense on what are your views with regard to secondary use or the reuse of primary care data. And so these are some of the findings here, where basically most participants were unaware of the reuse of their data. They were also not that it was not that problematic if it was happening within kind of the medical environment, but they also felt uncomfortable if they were not aware on what the purposes were and how it actually could be used against them as well. And so if you're interested, I really would point you to this kind of website, mainly because if you want to do it in your own context, the interesting thing is that they also posted a whole detailed run of show on how they engaged with citizens. So you can actually look into how would you do this within your own context and some scenarios as well. So that's kind of the first example. The next one, please, is then from here in the US, where there is something called the Data Quality Campaign, and they mainly focus on US states. But again, they just released this kind of report where they document a whole range of interesting engagements around data with communities. And again, there are really interesting use cases there that could be inspirational on how you go about engaging communities. First of all, around what are the questions they want to have answered, but also on how, anyway, what they feel is kind of appropriate. And one here is kind of the California Cradle to Career data system, which basically collects data across education systems, right? So that you know, for instance, anyway, how do people perform, right? And this is also one of the kind of applications. And yes, thanks, Alex. This is also what the European Health Data Space is trying to do. But I've also been in touch with the European Commission on that, advocating that they should actually also do this kind of community engagement on if you do this secondary use, how do you feel about that, right? And what are some of the conditions that you would have? And the only thing they have at the moment, Alex, is kind of an opt-out provision, which is not always the most proactive way to think about, anyway, is it what we do aligned with what communities want? And the next slide is a similar kind of effort. This is a recent paper that was published, which again is a kind of an interesting example where they actually developed citizen panels, right? And this, by the way, Alex, my recommendation for the European Health Data Space would be, why don't you create citizen panels, right, around the secondary use of data so that you actually get that social license for reusing data in ways that are aligned with kind of people's expectations. And again, this is kind of an interesting document where they provide a new protocol for setting up citizen panels around longitudinal linkage. So this is kind of, anyway, do you have the social license to linkage different data that was collected for different purposes in ways that, that's great, Alex, in ways that highly needed, by the way, in ways that aligns with the social license, right? So these are kind of examples. And again, what is great about this, we've been talking about social license for a while, but at least here we have some examples of actually organizations doing this in practice. And I hope that this will give us kind of a better understanding on how to do this well. Next slide. Then stewarding internal relations. And again, next slide. We don't have that much here, but I thought it was an interesting kind of example because one thing, by the way, and again, each time and I'm involved at the moment with kind of setting up a data governance regime for a large international standard setting body. And surprise, surprise, which we see all the time, one of the biggest challenges that companies and organizations and even government, of course, has is who is in charge, right? When it comes to data governance. And as you might remember from the course, we've been advocating for this kind of decision provenance, right? How do we know who is in charge at what part of the data lifecycle? And one way to do this is by developing a RACI or RACI, depending on your accent, is how you basically describe it. And so RACI stands for who is responsible, who is accountable, who needs to be consulted, and who needs to be informed, right? And what I thought was interesting about this recent blog was basically, and again, meaning I'm not advocating that this is the way you should always think about it, but at least it's a kind of an interesting application of the RACI model, right? Of the decision provenance model. And it would be interesting to see whether you can do this for your own organization or even within governments, right? So who actually defines policy? Is it a chief data officer or is it the data administration, or who needs to be consulted? Who needs to be informed? Who needs to be accountable, right? And so you can actually do this kind of RACI. Now, what we'll see, we've done this for several organizations, is that quite often many of those boxes are empty, which is kind of problematic, right? Because if no one is accountable, then you have a problem. Or in some boxes, there is duplication, right? And then you have a similar kind of problem as well with regard to understanding who is actually responsible as well. And I thought, anyway, I wanted to share this because I thought it was kind of an interesting example on how you develop a RACI or RACI kind of application and a decision provenance. We've done this in different ways, not about the defined policy, but basically about the data lifecycle, right? So who is responsible for collection? Who is responsible for processing and security and that kind of stuff? And I think it's interesting and important to do. Okay, next slide. Moving on. Then about stewarding sustainability. Next slide. Here, the question is, of course, anyway, how do you go about having access to data and what's the cost structure? And I just wanted to share a few recent developments. So this one is from the World Economic Forum, where anyway, they try to um, kind of understand, anyway, how do you get data in a way that is sustainable? And this was a whole article about the fact that many of the data that you could get about workforce data can actually be donated, right? This is the whole kind of issue of data donation. But then, of course, the key question is how do you set up data donation? Because again, data donation is one model to have sustainable data projects. But as we have seen, including within the within the European Union, where of course now, thanks to the Data Governance Act, you can have and set up data donation regimes. We haven't seen that many data donation regimes flourish and be registered. And the ones that are registered are kind of not really sustainable as well. And so that's the real challenge, of course, is that, anyway, how do you do this in a way that is systematic? But I thought it was an interesting article from the World Economic Forum to also look into kind of how do you do this as well. Next slide. The other one is then more about data cooperatives. And that was an interesting article by Trevor Schultz. Some of you might know Trevor Schultz. Trevor Schultz is here in New York, a professor at the New School, which is a university. Um, and um, and he kind of has led the whole movement with regard to platform cooperations, right, and platform cooperatives. And of course, one of the area that they are focused on is kind of data cooperatives. And so this article that appeared in the Harvard Business Review focuses on data cooperatives for AI, which is going to become more important, right? Where you can have, and of course, data cooperatives and cooperatives in general is basically a governance structure, right? But it is also a sustainability structure, right? It's a kind of a club good kind of environment. And so here in that article, they basically try to unpack what cooperatives can do in terms of shaping the future of AI through data cooperatives, right? So data that is managed. Because from my point of view, as some of you might know, the real point of leverage in the AI space, right, where you actually can set certain conditions, is at the input stage, right? Meanwhile, everyone in the AI governance has focused on kind of the output stage, right? How do you evaluate the output? My point of view is that that's way too late. There's not much that can be done at the output stage, except for perhaps indicating that it is hallucinating. But the real leverage is at the input stage. And so how do you create leverage with regard to appropriate use of data, but also making sure that then obviously the relevant data is being used for AI applications that might have implications for citizens as well. And that's where data cooperatives, because we have worked on this notion of data commons, which is another kind of vehicle, which is not, anyway, in competition with each other. Now, the interesting thing is that the data commons that they have, which I thought was interesting, the data cooperatives, sorry, that they have been able to identify, and there are not that many, I have to say, happen to be all agricultural based. And so, which is really interesting, is that most of the data cooperatives involves farmers or fishers or others that are actually collecting data around agriculture, like or dairy, for instance, or fishing, and that it's mainly in the agricultural space where they have managed to set up those data cooperatives to manage their own data in ways that they benefit from, but also be able to set then the kind of bargaining with regard to how that is used for other purposes, i.e. reuse as well, right? And I thought that was kind of interesting, and perhaps we should do a little bit more work and perhaps do a boot camp for, anyway, in the farming kind of environment, because that seems to be kind of super interesting and also aligned with what's happening. Next slide. And then the last thing, and here I want to mention, is of course that some of you know there's a lot of development in kind of the licensing space, data licensing space. And so I've been working and talking with the Creative Commons now for a while, and they just released this new licensing regime, which is called CC Signals, which is somewhat related to what we've been working on social license. Because what is CC Signals? Basically, it's a vehicle to signal preferences on how data is being reused. That's basically what it is, right? CC signals is kind of signaling preferences on how data is being reused. And what are then the preferences? Well, one is, of course, because this is mainly developed for content developers, it's signaling preferences by content developers on a attribution, right? Because as you know, a lot of the data is being extracted without attribution where they got the data, right? And so CC signals, one of the preferences that content providers can use the licensing is to say, well, we want to be attributed. The other are then mainly in terms of, and we want to be paid or not be paid. Or we want, which is interesting about the CC signals, is they also have an option where they say, and we want you to pay a third party, a third nonprofit to manage data, which could be, by the way, a way to create a revenue stream for those data donation vehicles, right? Where they say, okay, you can use my data, but then you have to fund a third party who is managing my data in ways that aligns with my signal, with my preferences. And so it's currently open for review. And so if you have not checked it out, check it out. You can also share with Creative Commons what your views are. And the only, of course, challenge at the moment is that it's basically a voluntary scheme, right? And so you can have a CC signal, but there is no way to enforce it in the current environment. And so that's kind of course, a weakness, but a challenge with many of those licenses, many of the open data licenses, by the way, as well. Okay, next slide. And then stewarding insights. This is my last slide here. Next slide. I think one of the elements, of course, that is always important is then how do you go from data to action? And so for the last anyway, I started looking more and more as you know, into decision intelligence, but also looking more and more in actually very good use cases of data storytelling. And so this is kind of a recent winner, which you may want to check out on data-driven storytelling, where anyway, it shows that you can go beyond a dashboard. And if you want to basically have impact, it might be good to work with journalists to actually really unpack kind of a story. And this was a story that was about kind of Medicare, I mean, in the US, Medicare fraud. And so they could have basically just have put out a dashboard, but they developed a whole series of stories around the data that they collected. And it also had major impact on policy making. And it also led to this kind of data-driven storytelling award, which is issued by this organization here, mainly focusing on healthcare issues. And so I give an example here. There are many other examples, but I think it would be good for data stewards to also be inspired by those data stories. And there are a few award places where they award data storytelling. And so you may want to anyway subscribe to kind of being updated on what is being awarded as it relates to data storytelling as well. And so with that, I'm gonna stop here, and perhaps we can stop the recording